If someone deliberately hurts you, and then your entire family laughs, calling it a joke, and when you're lying in the hospital in pain, they say, "It's your fault for not looking carefully," then you'll understand why an ordinary person can turn into a burning flame of hatred. This is Revenge Mark. If you've ever been hurt by your own family, subscribe. This story is for you. I never thought there would come a day I'd leave a family dinner on a stretcher, but that night I was lying on the floor, my lips drained of color, blood soaking through my dress, dripping onto the wooden floor, and Franklin Linwood, my uncle, stood there, grinning widely, still holding a hammer. Honestly, I was just messing around. Harper's always way too serious. 6:43 p.m., Boulder, Colorado. My family gathers every June for our annual dinner, always at Uncle Frank's house. Everything was the same as every year: laughter, photos, grabbing barbecued meat, retelling old stories. I took my usual seat by the window, the chair I always chose, and then, clink. The first thing I felt was shock, then sharpness, stabbing, as if a blade had pierced from my left thigh straight up my spine. I screamed. The whole room went silent. Every eye turned to me, then down to the floor, where my blood was dripping. Frank walked over, casually pulled out a sharp nail nearly 4 inches long. Guess it didn't go in that deep. Right, he shrugged, then chuckled. I didn't laugh. I couldn't speak. All I could hear was my own pounding heartbeat in my head and the pain shooting down my leg like an electric current. Trevor, my cousin, clapped. Oh my God, Frank. Still the king of jump scares, Rachel, my sister-in-law, raised her phone. This would blow up on TikTok with 1 million views easy. My mother, Diane Whitmore, just exhaled softly, her eyes avoiding mine. I was in the hospital in under 30 minutes. Dr. Karen Whitman, the attending physician, looked far from amused as she studied my MRI results. Sciatic nerve damage. The nail went through the soft tissue and came right up against the nerve. She looked up, her tone gentler. Harper, you're going to need months of rehab, possibly surgery. It sounded like water rushing past my ears. The whole room spun. But what hurt the most wasn't in my medical report. The next evening, I returned, leaning on crutches, pale, painkillers still coursing through me. Frank sat at the head of the table, looked at me, and smirked. Next time, pay attention before you sit down. Same chair as always. So where's the chair's fault in that? Trevor smirked. Rachel scrolled on her phone. My mother sipped her tea silently, and I realized no one here felt guilty. No one stood up for me. Not a single person asked why a man in his 50s would put a nail in a chair. That night, I lay on my side, one hand pressing the gauze, the other clenched so tight it went numb. In my head was only one image: that bloodied nail, and Frank was smiling like he'd just won a chess match. I remembered, when I was little, Uncle Frank used to say, sometimes you've got to stay quiet, for the family's sake. Back then, I believed him, but now, I swear I will never stay quiet another second. I spent the first 3 nights relearning how to sleep. No position felt right. Lying on my left side brought sharp stabs of pain. Lying on my back left me numb, and lying on my right, I could only feel tears sliding into my ear. My body had become something I didn't recognize. Every morning when I woke up, I had to spend 5 minutes just practicing breathing through the nerve spasms. Dr. Whitman told me, the pain will ease over time, but nerve damage can't be rushed. It lingers. It tests both your endurance and your patience. I nodded. But in truth, my patience had run out long ago. A week after the incident, I still hadn't received a single apology. Not from Frank, not from Trevor or Rachel, and I emphasize not, from my mother. Diane came to visit me on Saturday afternoon, bringing a bag of fruit and a strained smile. I didn't know if you like green grapes or red ones, so I got both, she said as she stepped inside. I was sitting on the couch, legs stretched out, back propped up with pillows. I can't eat them. I'm on anti-inflammatory meds. The doctor told me to avoid acidic foods. She froze for a moment, then set the fruit down. She didn't ask anything else. I didn't want to seem cold. I'm not the kind of person who carries grudges everywhere, but for the first time in my life, I felt small in front of my mother. Not because she scolded me, but because she avoided talking about the most important thing. It was as if by not mentioning it, it had never happened. I tried to bring it up. What do you think? About the chair. Diane looked up, still peeling the label off a water bottle. Frank. He didn't mean to hurt you. He just didn't think about the consequences. That sentence made me want to smash the bottle against the wall. Didn't think about the consequences, I repeated, my voice hissing through my teeth. Mom, if I drove a nail into someone's chair, the first thing I'd think about is the consequences, not about laughing. She stayed silent, staring into the water bottle as if it held the answer. That night, I had a dream. I was sitting in that dining room again, only this time, everyone was laughing louder. Frank stood up, nails in both hands, tapping them like instruments. Trevor was live streaming. Rachel had made a new filter, Destiny chair. My mother sat at the end of the table, eyes closed, as if she were praying. I jolted awake at 3:27 a.m., drenched in sweat. I could no longer tell where the real pain ended and the panic began. I started to pull back. I turned off family group notifications. I didn't reply to relatives' small talk messages. I needed space. But I knew deep down they weren't asking out of concern. They were asking to make sure I wasn't going to do anything impulsive. Because if I spoke up, the one losing face wouldn't be me. It would be them. Melly, my cousin, was the only one who called me without avoiding the truth. She asked directly, Harper, do you want to sue? I stayed silent. Then I asked her back, do you think I should not for the money? Melly said, but if you don't, they'll think it's normal. They'll do it to someone else. I didn't answer right away, but her words pierced my heart like the nail had once done. Every time I looked at the scar slowly healing on my thigh, I heard Frank's voice. It was just a joke, and I knew, if I stayed silent, that sentence would become the truth. A wound, whether from a nail or from words, always leaves a mark. And when your whole family chooses to turn away, can you walk into the darkness alone, just to reclaim the light? I thought, if I just endured it quietly, everything would eventually blow over. But I was wrong. My silence only gave them space to tell the story the way they wanted. And in their version, I wasn't the victim anymore. I became the punchline. I saw the post on the morning of the 10th day. Rachel had posted a photo of the entire extended family gathered around the dinner table. I wasn't in the picture. Only the chair. The very chair that had made me bleed and sent me into convulsions. The caption read, "A memorable dinner with the Linwood family." A little hiccup. but we're all fine. The comments poured in. What happened? Did someone fall off a chair? And then Rachel replied, just someone being overly sensitive. I sat there, my heart pounding, not from pain, not from anger, but from sheer horror. Not one person stepped in to stop it. I sent a screenshot of the post to my mother. I added only one line, "What do you think 2 hours later?" Diane replied, "Frank didn't mean it. Don't let social media make it worse for you." I set the phone down. I felt my chest turn to stone. They didn't see it as wrong. They saw it as inconvenient. That night, I opened my filing cabinet and pulled out my medical records. For the first time, I studied the MRI image carefully, the black ink line that read S1 nerve root damage, left side. Just one sentence. But for me, it carried the weight of a nightmare. I began taking notes. When the pain appeared, how many hours could I sit, which medications worked, and how long before they wore off? I didn't know exactly why I was doing it, but I knew I needed to record everything. The next day, Trevor sent me a message. "You should stop. Everyone in the family feels awkward. If you blow this small thing out of proportion, how will you live among the relatives later?" I read each word again. Small thing, awkward. Not a single expression of concern. Not a hint of remorse. Just a warning. I turned on my computer and typed "personal injury lawyer" in Boulder. At the top of the search results was a name, Luis DeSoto. I didn't click right away. I stared at the screen, my hand resting lightly on the mouse. Then I closed the laptop. I didn't know what scared me more, the fear of being rejected or the fear of starting. I called Melly back. Her voice was warm and steady. "Are you okay?" she asked. I sighed. "Do you think I should sue, not for the money?" she said, "but because if you don't speak up, no one will believe you were really hurt. Everything will get buried. Can you live with that?" I stayed quiet for a long time. I looked out the window. A truck was backing into the lot, horn blaring. No one could hear the scream I was holding inside. I remembered that day curled up on the floor, blood seeping onto the wood, the whole family watching, and Frank. Frank was laughing. That smile. I can't erase it from my mind. I turned the laptop back on, opened DeSoto's page, read his entire bio. The very first line on the site. "No pain is a joke." My throat tightened. This time, I didn't close the laptop. There are some pains no one will acknowledge except the one who carries them. Do you have the courage to turn your pain into a truth the world must recognize? Summer in Boulder begins with a dry, burning heat. My skin peels in thin layers from the medication, the sunlight, and the sweat breaking out every time that nerve pain shoots down my leg. But that's also when I began to shift. Not the kind of shift you see in movies where you wake up one morning knowing exactly what to do. This was little by little. Like a scar slowly sealing shut, itching, aching, impossible to ignore. I made an appointment with the law office of Luis DeSoto. 9 a.m., Monday. I wore a light blue shirt, sleeves rolled up, afraid of looking too fragile. Luis was a quiet man with thin glasses and eyes that observed far more than they spoke. He listened to everything, never interrupted, only nodded from time to time or asked short, precise questions. "Do you have evidence of that incident? Has your current injury been officially documented? Was anyone else there who witnessed the entire event?" I handed him a copy of my MRI results, photos of the chair, copies of the hospital bills, and the audio recording of my conversation with my mother. I never thought I would have to prepare a battle file about my own family. But the more I gathered, the more I realized they had left me no other choice. I hired a private physical therapy coach, not just to recover the function, but so I could stand strong if I had to go to court. I practiced deep breathing, practiced standing for long stretches, practiced walking without wincing, because there is nothing crueler than a woman in pain being dismissed as faking it. I reset every social media security setting, every post, every message, every comment about the accident was archived. I learned how to take screenshots with shortcuts and how to save the edit history of posts. Not because I was afraid they'd twist the truth, but because I knew they would. Melly stopped by over the weekend. She set a small bag on the table. Inside was a leather notebook, a fountain pen, and an external hard drive. "For you," she said. "Write down everything, even the things you don't think matter." I didn't ask why. I just nodded. Sometimes I still doubted myself. Looking in the mirror, I saw an empty Harper. A Harper my family had tried to define weak, oversensitive, overreacting. But during one therapy session, my trainer said, "You're doing something most people don't have the courage to do. You're not weak." That sentence, so simple. Yet it caught in my throat, because for the first time in weeks, I felt not small. I was no longer the woman who had been stabbed by a nail. I was the one about to turn it into evidence, into justice, and if necessary, into a lesson. When justice isn't handed to you, you have to make it yourself. But will this journey heal me, or will it only carve the wounds deeper? Some apologies come too late. Some wounds never heal if no one acknowledges they ever existed. If you've ever been hurt, buried under the laughter of your own family, subscribe to Revenge Mark, because justice never comes from silence. I sent the letter on a Tuesday morning. The weather was strangely beautiful. The sky was blue as if nothing had ever gone wrong. Luis, my lawyer, had me review the letter one last time. It was 3 pages long. The tone was calm, cold, precise. It opened with a description of the incident. In the middle, it listed concrete evidence, nail photos, medical diagnoses, payment records, testimony from Melly, the only person who confirmed I had been seriously injured. At the end, it stated the amount $75,000 in compensation for medical, emotional, and rehabilitation damages. Recipient Franklin Linwood, with a copy sent to any attorney representing the family. I signed my name. My hand didn't shake. I imagined Frank's face when he got the letter, that familiar frown. The first words out of his mouth would surely be, "That girl has lost her mind." And that thought made me feel strangely calm. A week later, I got a call from an unfamiliar number. "This is Emily Reeves, legal representative for Mr. Linwood. We have received your letter." Her voice was professional, but I could hear one thing clearly: tension. Mr. Linwood denies all allegations. "But we would like to discuss this before the matter becomes public. Luis advised me to stay silent. We've made our move. Now let them make theirs." I agreed. That evening, Trevor texted me, "You really think you can make money by dragging your uncle's name through the mud?" I didn't reply, but I kept the message. Luis told me, "Indirect threat, even better." 2 days later, I got an email. It was from a journalist named Clara Moreau, from a local legal affairs outlet. "We've received inside information about a family injury lawsuit. If you're willing, I'd like to hear your side as someone who's truly been hurt." I didn't know who had spoken. Maybe Melly, maybe someone at the law office. I didn't reply immediately, but for the first time, I noticed something shifting. People were starting to listen to me. Rachel deleted her Facebook post. The old post with the chair and the mocking caption disappeared without a trace. I smiled faintly, not out of glee, but because I had been right to keep that screenshot. My mother called after more than 3 weeks of silence. "Harper, is this really necessary?" I didn't answer right away. Then I said, "You once told me Frank didn't mean it. You said I was too sensitive. Do you think, if I did nothing, they would stop on the other end?" Silence stretched. "I just don't want the family to fall apart." I took a deep breath. It's been broken for a long time. Mom, I'm just picking up my own pieces. I don't know what the future will hold. But that day, when I closed my laptop, I smiled, because finally, I was no longer the passive one. I had thrown the first stone, and that still, quiet pond was beginning to ripple. A letter can change the game. But is it the start of the truth, or the start of a storm? A week after the letter was sent, everything suddenly fell into a strange silence. No more emails from their lawyer. No messages. No news reports. It was as if they were holding their breath. I started to get a feeling, not peace, but the stillness before a storm. And then, the storm came. On Friday night, I opened my mailbox. A thick envelope sat neatly inside. No postage stamp. Clearly, someone had placed it there by hand. No sender's name on the outside, but I recognized the handwriting instantly. It was my mother's. I tore it open. Inside was a handwritten legal statement. 3 pages. Signed by 3 people: my mother, Trevor, and Rachel. The content claimed that I had a history of emotional instability, had acted impulsively in the past, and might have inflicted harm on myself to fabricate accusations. I read until I reached the line, "Harper has previously shown signs of depression and was once advised by a psychologist to take a leave from teaching." I froze. That part was true, but not the whole truth. I had taken a leave from teaching at 29 because I lost a student in an accident. I needed time to overcome the trauma. I came back stronger, but now they were turning it into evidence against me. I threw the papers onto the table. My heart pounded. My hands shook. But this time, it wasn't from pain. It was from rage. Luis came over the next morning. He read every page carefully, frowning. "You okay?" he asked. I didn't answer. I just pointed to the last line of the statement. "We believe Harper is deliberately trying to damage the family's reputation out of jealousy and a desire for attention." Luis nodded slowly. "This is their first move. They're building a narrative. We'll have to dismantle it before it takes root." I didn't cry. I didn't scream. But I felt myself shrink inside, not because I was afraid they would win, but because my mother had signed it. She didn't tell me, didn't call, didn't send a warning, just stayed silent and put her name on it. That night, Melly called. She said, "I heard. Harper, you're not alone." I laughed. "Pretty sure I look alone to you," Melly replied. "There's a way to hit back, but you have to be sure. Do you remember when Claire accidentally filmed a TikTok during that dinner I froze? Claire, Trevor, and Rachel's daughter, a 10th grader, loved making videos, always had her phone up. I had never paid attention to that kid. But now, I'll try to message her." Melly said, "If that video still exists, It will prove at least one thing, Frank laughed, and no one stopped him. I nodded, even though Melly couldn't see me. The next morning, I got an email from an unknown address. It contained an 18-second video file. Low quality, side angle, but clear enough. Frank walked up, hammer in hand, slammed it hard onto the chair. Then he said, "Let's see how that girl reacts." The whole table burst out laughing. Glasses clinked. Someone shouted, "Take a picture." Then the video cut off. I sat frozen, then picked up my phone and sent it to Luis without a single extra word. When the truth begins to surface, liars will twist it every way they can. But if one short video can flip the whole story, does Harper have the strength to turn it into a counterattack? I don't know why Claire sent the video. Maybe she was just curious. Maybe her young conscience finally stirred. Or simply, she realized this wasn't fun anymore. But whatever the reason, that video changed everything. Luis watched the 18-second clip at least 10 times. He didn't say much, just sat there, tapping his fingers lightly on the table. Then he stood, pulled out his phone, and made a call. "I want to set up a mediation meeting before the hearing," he said. Then he turned to me. "We're not sending this ahead of time. We have to let it hit at exactly the right moment." 3 days later, I was sitting in a large conference room at the law office, facing Frank, Rachel, Trevor, and their attorney. My mother didn't come. I didn't ask why. I didn't have the strength to be disappointed anymore. Their lawyer started. Her voice was flat. "My client denies all allegations. There was no intent to cause harm. The act was in the nature of a family joke, not exceeding reasonable boundaries within the family." Luis stayed calm, nodding. "Then please take a look at a clip provided by a member of the family." He pressed the button. The room went silent. The sound of a hammer striking a chair rang out like a gunshot. Frank's voice came through clearly. "Let's see how that little brat reacts." Laughter, clinking glasses. The words, "Take a picture." Rachel's eyes widened. Trevor slouched back into his chair. Frank didn't blink. His face flushed, all the blood rushing to his forehead. Their lawyer quickly asked, "Where did this video come from?" "Was it edited?" Luis answered instantly. "Original, full metadata intact. And it was filmed by your client's own granddaughter." I didn't look at anyone. I looked at my hands, clenched together under the table. I had thought, coming here, that I would shake, that I would get angry, explode, or break down in tears. But I didn't. I was just calm, like someone standing in the middle of a storm who already knows exactly where it's heading. Frank stood up. "This has gone too far. She Harper. She's not a victim. She wants money. She wants to destroy this family." No one replied. Trevor still didn't lift his head. Rachel stared at the door. Their lawyer asked for a recess. When they left the room, Luis turned to me and quietly said, "You've just scored a critical turning point. From this moment on, they can no longer deny it." I breathed slowly, didn't smile, just nodded. That night, I got a message from someone I never expected, Claire. I didn't know it would turn into this, but at least now everyone's seen the truth. I read it over and over, wanted to write something back, but then I just typed, "Thank you." That's the only thing I needed. This victory didn't lift the weight off me. It didn't erase the pain. It didn't mend the trust, but it cracked open the first sliver of light. When the truth finally speaks, will the one who caused the harm realize their wrongdoing, or prepare an even harsher counterattack? I thought. Once the truth came out, everything would start to make sense. But I forgot one thing. Some people don't live for the truth. They live for control. And when they lose it, they'll do anything to take it back. 4 days after the meeting, I got news from Luis. He called, his voice dropping low. They just filed a countersuit. The claim is that you deliberately defamed them, damaged the family's reputation, and this is the most serious part. You have a history of psychological instability that poses a danger to former students. I froze in the middle of the kitchen. The knife I was using to slice carrots slipped from my hand and hit the floor with a sharp metallic clang. I couldn't breathe. I stammered. They're dragging up. Something from my former student Luis's reply was short. They're trying to twist the story into making it look like you've been unstable for years, that everything you've said is just exaggerated imagination. I sank into a chair. My heart was pounding. I had never felt so filthy. 3 years ago, one of my students, Elliot, took his own life after his parents divorced. I was the last person he spoke to. I carried unbearable guilt. I went to therapy. I took a 3-month leave from teaching. I had moved past it. I thought I had, but now they were using it as a weapon. Luis was thoughtful. We can fight this. But if this file leaks, the media might dig deeper. I understood. Frank wasn't trying to win in court. He was trying to destroy me before I could even get there. That afternoon, I sat in my car. I didn't drive anywhere. I just sat there. No music, no air conditioning. I let the humiliation rise, like water flooding the seats. My phone buzzed. It was my mother. I didn't answer. An hour later, a text came in. Frank says you're making all this up to get revenge on the whole family. I don't know who to believe anymore. I'm just too tired. I closed the phone without reading further. No one needed to tell me. I knew. I had lost my mother. That night, an article popped up on a local education forum. Headline: teacher once suspended for emotional outburst, now suing family for injury compensation. No name, but enough details for people to know it was me. Luis called again. They're going low. Are you sure you still want to go through with this? I closed my eyes. Elliot's face came back to me. Those clear eyes, that trembling voice on his last day. I remembered telling him, you deserve to be heard, even if the whole world turns its back. Now, it was my turn to believe that. When the truth is twisted, can a woman standing alone really fight against a machine powered by lies, influence, and blood ties? I used to think. The worst pain was being betrayed, but it wasn't. The deepest pain was looking around and realizing there was no one left to call by name. Luis told me I should step away from social media for a while. We couldn't know for sure who had leaked the information, but clearly, someone on Frank's side had fed details to the press. I locked my Facebook, closed my Instagram account, shut down my personal email. My phone was set so only 2 numbers could ring through: Luis and Melly. I didn't go outside for 3 days. Not because I was afraid someone would recognize me, but because I didn't want anyone to see me like this, an empty shell of a person. I didn't eat lunch, didn't go to physical therapy, didn't turn on the lights. The apartment slowly turned into a cramped box, damp and heavy with the smell of defeat. On Tuesday night, I switched on the kitchen light for the first time in days. I noticed the notebook Melly had given me still sitting on the table. A thin layer of dust covered it. I opened it. The very first page my handwriting from the day I filed the lawsuit against Frank. If no one will acknowledge your truth, then you have to write it down, line by line. I let out a small laugh. My voice sounded foreign, like I didn't believe I was the one who had written that sentence anymore. Luis called just as I was about to turn the light off. A new attorney has been assigned to Frank's side. This one is very skilled, very ruthless. They'll stop at nothing. I let my head fall onto the table. My chin touched the cold wood surface. I didn't cry. I just breathed. But every breath felt like being pulled backward, deeper into the dark. When I was in high school, I once fainted from low blood pressure in the gym. That feeling, my vision going black, ears ringing, then everything closing in like cold water splashed over my face. I remember it vividly because it was the first time I'd felt completely powerless. Now, that feeling was back. Not in my body, but in my heart. I opened my laptop, typed into the search bar what to do when you're the only one who believes the truth. No clear answers, just hollow articles, crisis hotline numbers, and a few quotes about believing in yourself. I shut the computer. That night, I dreamed I was back at a family dinner. Everyone was sitting around, laughing and chatting. I walked into the room. No one looked at me. I called each person by name. No one turned around. I shouted. I slammed the table. I cried. I begged. Finally, Frank stood up. He picked up a hammer and walked toward me. And my mother, standing beside him, just softly said, "Harper, you're overreacting again." I jolted awake. Sweat drenched me. My whole body trembled. I couldn't tell whether that was a dream or a memory bleeding through. I picked up my phone, pulled up Melly's name. I didn't call, just stared at it, then set the phone down. When is rock bottom? Is it when no one believes you or when you start to stop believing in yourself? There are people who no longer have the strength to scream, but they still need to be heard. If you've ever been in that deep place where no one believes you, where you start doubting yourself, sign up for Revenge Mark. This is a space for truths that have been forgotten. I turned my phone back on after 4 days of silence, not because I felt better, but because I was afraid that if I didn't do something, I would stay underwater forever. There were 2 missed calls from Melly. One message, "Harper, if you see this, I found something." Attached was a screenshot of an old chat between Claire and someone else. I tapped to open it. The first line from Claire read, "I think Uncle Frank went too far. I saw him smash the chair and actually put nails in it." The other person replied, "Don't talk about this anymore. If you keep talking, you won't be allowed at family gatherings anymore." Got it. The sender's name, Rachel Linwood. I shot upright. Cold sweat slid down my spine. I read that exchange at least 3 times, not because I doubted what it said, but because I was feeling something again. Hope. I called Melly, for the first time in days. My voice didn't shake. "Do you have the full version?" "Yes," she said. "Claire sent me everything. The original. No edits." I nodded, as if Melly were sitting right in front of me. Luis took in the evidence like a man gulping down oxygen after suffocating. Rachel was stopping a witness. This is obstruction of the legal process. I didn't smile, but inside, something pricked, like a needle-piercing stone, leaving the very first crack. That night, I opened my old notebook, wrote a single line. I don't need everyone to believe me. I just need one person to say I saw it. I went back to my therapy room. My old trainer's eyes widened when she saw me. I thought you'd quit for good. I shook my head. No, I still have work to do. I practiced walking again, standing for longer than 10 minutes, breathing deeply to relieve muscle tension. I didn't talk about the lawsuit, didn't talk about my mother. I just focused on each step. 1, stand. 2, hold my balance. 3, don't collapse again. Melly called the next evening. I think Claire's ready to testify, if her identity can be protected. I closed my eyes. Are you sure, positive? Claire said, I want to do what's right, even if my parents hate me for it. I pressed my lips together, then said slowly, some things matter more than family. When a small spark is enough to light up the darkness, will Harper dare to hold on to it and rewrite her own life? Monday. The sky was overcast, a light breeze slipping through the window frame. I sat in Luis's office, eyes fixed on the evidence board he had set up on the wall. Documents, photographs, text messages, videos, statements. We had pieced every fragment together into a complete picture. Luis pointed to the center of the board, a photo of Frank. Below it, 2 red arrows connected to 2 lines of text. Intentional infliction of bodily harm, concealment and witness manipulation. I went still. Not because I hadn't seen them before, but because, for the first time, I saw everything so clearly it was impossible to deny. What's our strategy? I asked. Luis nodded. 3 steps. First, submit the additional chat logs between Rachel and Claire to the court for obstruction of justice. Second, request that Claire testify as a protected anonymous witness. Third, present the medical diagnosis file and the video of Frank saying, let's see how that girl reacts. All in the same hearing. I swallowed hard. My voice dropped. What if we lose? Luis looked at me for a long moment, then replied, right now, there's only one person who can ruin everything, and that's you. I nodded. No smile. Back home, I rewrote my entire testimony by hand. I wanted to remember every detail, not just to tell it in court, but to face myself. When I got to the part where Frank pulled the nail out of the chair and said, just kidding, my grip on the pen tightened. I stopped, closed my eyes, then kept writing. That night, Claire sent a voice recording, only 60 seconds. I confirmed that Uncle Frank had planned with my dad to take the joke too far. I heard him clearly say, you better watch that girl. She's gonna blow up just like when she was still teaching. I think that needs to be brought up. I didn't cry when I heard it. I just wondered, why would a child that brave grow up among people like that? Luis sent me the hearing plan. 4 parts of the presentation, 1 part rebuttal, and finally, direct confrontation. I read those words and felt my heart go cold. Frank would be sitting across from me, eye to eye. No dinner party, no wooden chair, only the truth, and words that could never be taken back. I practiced speaking in front of the mirror. No trembling voice, no repeating myself, no breaking mid-sentence. I trained my gaze, no looking away. I learned how to stand, adjust the chair, and walk to the center of the room without holding on to anything. I looked at my eyes, no longer bright, but steady. The steadiness of someone who has broken, but not shattered. As the final battle draws near, Will Harper keep her clarity long enough to make the one who caused all this boo to justice? The court opened at 8:30 a.m. I arrived half an hour early, not because I was anxious, but because I needed to stand alone, take a deep breath, and remind myself why I was here. Not for revenge, not for reputation, but for justice. The very thing that has been disregarded my entire life. Luis adjusted the collar of his suit jacket, holding a hardbound folder of documents. He gave me a nod. He didn't say a word, but his eyes were clear. You're ready. The hearing room was smaller than I'd imagined. Only 8 rows of seats, a central podium, and 2 sets of tables facing each other. Frank sat on the other side. His back was straight, his gaze sharp, but no longer as arrogant as before. Beside him was Rachel, her eyes glued to her phone. Trevor was nowhere to be seen. I didn't see my mother either. Part of me still waited, for a glance, a gesture, a whispered word. Nothing. The judge entered. Everyone stood, then sat again. The air was heavy as lead. Luis began. He spoke clearly and logically, presenting the video, Claire's testimony, and the medical diagnosis. Each piece of evidence was neatly displayed on the large screen, with no drama or embellishment, just clarity and precision. Frank never looked up. He stared at his own hands, clasped tightly together. When it was the defense's turn, Frank's new attorney stood. Her voice was cold and hard as steel. Mr. Linwood's actions were an unfortunate prank, without malicious intent. We believe the plaintiff has exaggerated the consequences in order to tarnish the family's reputation. Then she paused. Her eyes locked directly on me. And if necessary, we will request a review of the plaintiff's mental capacity based on the psychological history from the incident 3 years ago. The room fell silent. My heart pounded fast. It felt like someone had just ripped open an old wound, tearing apart what had barely healed. Luis placed a gentle hand on my back. I didn't turn toward him. I didn't cry. I simply stood up. Walked to the witness stand. I looked straight into the judge's eyes. Yes, I once sought counseling after one of my students took their own life, because I loved my work, and I felt I wasn't enough to save a child. I turned toward Frank, but no one needs therapy because they were stabbed with a nail during a family meal. No one calls that a prank. And no one should stay silent when it happens right in front of them. Rachel lowered her head. Frank shifted in his seat, as if to say something, but his attorney held his shoulder. I turned back to the judge. I'm not here for revenge. I'm here because I still believe that justice is the one thing that must never be silenced. I don't remember exactly how many minutes I spoke. I only remember that when I returned to my seat. Luis leaned in and whispered, "You just took away their advantage." But when people who have thrived in the shadows are dragged into the light, will they retreat? Or will they strike back one last time after the hearing? The judge called for a 15-minute recess before delivering the verdict on compensation obligations and legal liability. I stepped out of the courtroom, standing in the cold hallway. My hand rested over my chest, right where my heart was beating unevenly. I wasn't afraid of losing. I was only afraid I might go too far. Frank was standing at the far end of the hallway, alone. No Rachel, no attorney, just him and me. I hadn't planned to walk over, but my feet, they just moved. Quietly, deliberately. Frank saw me. He didn't look away. I stopped about 2 meters from him. No closer. "You've won," he said, his voice hoarse. I didn't answer. The whole family will talk about this for the rest of their lives. Are you satisfied now? I took a deep breath. No, I replied. I'm not satisfied. But I'm relieved. He frowned. Relieved, I nodded, because at last, I don't have to pretend anymore. Frank let out a laugh, dry, short of breath. You think everything's going to be fine after today? Will people love you again? Will your mother hold you in her arms? That last question cut deep. I looked him straight in the eye. No, I said. But at least now, I don't feel small anymore. I'm no longer the obedient niece you expect. No longer the one who sits down and laughs things off. No longer afraid of my mother's gaze. No longer feeling like everyone's right and I'm wrong. Frank stayed silent. I thought I saw his eyes blink just once. I stepped a little closer. My voice lowered. You know what hurts the most. It's not the nail. It's not the rumors. It's not losing my mother. All of that. I can get through. But the worst pain is when I screamed in silence, and still no one turned back. Frank lowered his gaze to the floor. I didn't expect an apology. Didn't hope he would crumble. I just needed him to understand I had seen him more clearly than ever before. The judge called us back into the courtroom. Luis looked at me. You okay? I nodded. Let's finish this. The verdict was read in a steady voice, but each word dropped like a bell toll. Frank Linwood was found personally liable for intentional infliction of injury, ordered to pay administrative fines and compensation totaling $75,000. Deadline for compliance 30 days. I didn't look back at Frank. I just walked out of the courtroom, head held high. My back still hurts, but my spirit stood tall as if it had never known the word bow. When a woman stands up for herself, is victory truly the end, or merely the threshold of another kind of loss? I stepped out of the courthouse, the sunlight grazing my cheek, the smell of asphalt warming with the rhythm of passing traffic. $75,000. A suspended sentence. A local news segment named Frank in the Citizen Ethics Violations column. I had won. But why? Didn't my heart feel entirely triumphant? Luis said. We did it. As he walked me to the steps, I gave a faint smile. Not a full one. Not a burst of joy. Just enough to let him know I was still standing. That evening, I sat on the living room floor. No lights on. Just leaning back against the wall, watching the slanted sunset spill through the window. The old wooden chair I had sat in the day I was hurt was still there. I hadn't thrown it away. I'm not sure why. Maybe because I never wanted to erase it completely, just to understand it. Melly called. She said, Claire wants to see you once, before her family moves away. I stayed silent, then nodded, though Melly couldn't see. They came on Saturday afternoon. Claire wore a purple sweater, her hair tied high. She still looked like a kid, but her eyes held a weight beyond her years. I'm sorry I didn't send the video sooner, Claire said, sitting perched on the edge of the chair. I shook my head. You did it when you were brave enough. Not everyone dares to go against their family. Claire pressed her lips together. I don't hate my parents, but now I understand. Silence is also complicity. After they left, I stayed in the empty apartment. No one said it, but I knew. I had lost them. Not just Frank, but Trevor, Rachel. All the ones who once called me good little Harpy. And my mother. She didn't text. She didn't call. Not a single word. No flowers. No anger. No forgiveness, just absence. I remembered once, as a child, I argued with her. I slammed the door and shouted that she didn't understand me. She didn't respond, just stood there, folding clothes. Back then, I thought she was cold. But now, I think maybe she didn't know how to face the truth. Just like now, revenge doesn't erase the past. It only draws the line I've had enough. I began sleeping through the night for the first time in months. No dreams, no image of the nail, no sound of Frank's laugh. Hard and final like a hammer, just a quiet darkness. I ran into a few old colleagues from school. They asked, gently, without prying. I told them I wasn't ready to go back to teaching yet. Not out of fear, but because I'm still relearning myself. One morning, I received a package with no return address. Inside was a black and white photo of me in 9th grade. Bright eyes, hair in pigtails, and a small note. Don't let what they did define who you are. Mom, I don't know if it really came from her. The signature wasn't clear, but I cried. For the first time, not out of bitterness, but because my heart still had a soft place left to breathe. Revenge gave me justice, but the price was a part of my family that will never come back. I used to believe that once I won, everything would go back to normal. That someday, I would wake up and feel as if there had never been a nail, never a courtroom, never that vacant look in my mother's eyes. Only me, whole again. But the truth is, there will never be that old normal again. And maybe that's how it's meant to be. I left Boulder on an early autumn morning. The sky was misty, still. I drove past familiar streets, familiar houses that no longer felt like home. There was a kind of silence in the city, like when you step out of a movie theater at noon harsh daylight, but your mind is still trapped in the story you just watched. I didn't go far, just to a small town near the lake, a place with many trees, many birds, and few people who knew my name. The new house wasn't big. White painted walls, slanted roof, a porch just wide enough to sit and read in the sunlight. For the first time in months, I could sit without bracing myself, without waiting for someone to strike back. Just sitting, breathing. Peace is as if it were the most natural thing in the world. I spent time tending the garden, something I never understood why my mother loved so much. But there's something very real about putting your hands in the soil, caring for each bed, watching green shoots push through as if whispering, everything can start again. One morning, I got an email from my old school's office. The new principal invited me to come back and work part-time. I read the letter, smiled, and replied, "Thank you for remembering me. But I'm learning a different lesson right now, about quietness and the strength in it. I'm not ready to teach again, but I am living right." I began to write, not to accuse Frank, not to dwell on loss, but to gather the fragments of the story and tell it my way. I wrote about the chair, about the fall, about the metallic silence of endless nights. But I also wrote about Claire, about Melly, and about a mother who didn't know how to hold her child when they were hurting, but could send an old book with purple ink handwriting inside, "No one is completely right. No one is wrong forever." I'm not sure if it really was from my mother, but I keep that book like an unfinished sentence, like a thin thread that still hasn't completely snapped between us. Frank never apologized, and I never waited for it. I didn't forgive, but I chose not to speak his name every day. I chose not to imprison myself in the role of the victim. One evening, I sat on the porch. The wind rustled through the leaves, the smell of damp wood drifting up like the scent of childhood. I thought about the first moment I realized I had won the case. It wasn't when the judge struck the gavel. It was when I stood in front of Frank, looked him straight in the eye, and didn't shake anymore. I had reclaimed what I thought I'd lost worth. Voice. Myself. Victory doesn't always mean fireworks. Sometimes it's just a perfect, complete stillness. No more proving, no more fear, no more hoping someone will come back to love you. I looked down at my hands, now steady, no longer trembling like before. Then I lifted my head. The sky was darkening, but not gloomy. It was simply another day coming to a close, and I was still here, no longer needing anyone's approval, no longer looking back. I had stepped out of the shadows, and I was still moving toward freedom, toward myself. You've just walked with Harper through a journey that wasn't easy. From that seemingly meaningless fall in the middle of a family dinner, to the moment she stepped into the light, no longer the victim, but her own person, steady, free. This story isn't just about revenge. It's about voice, about the cost of silence, and about the strength of standing up, even when no one stands with you. If you've ever felt dismissed, pushed to the sidelines, or wondered, am I overreacting? Let this be your reminder. You're not crazy. You're not weak. You deserve to be believed and heard. Share this story if you know someone who needs it, and don't forget to subscribe to Revenge Mark so you won't miss the next powerful journeys ahead. Because justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's just a sigh, no longer held back.